Let's take you to this conversation now. As many people get ready for New Year's celebrations, we highlight an aspect of our history that is not worth celebrating. Now, that is slavery in the Cape Colony. The annual Tweede Nuwe Jaar celebration in Cape Town has its roots in this period. Now, Tariq Mellet, a Cape slavery historian, author and councillor at the South African Heritage Resources Agency, joins us now via our video link to discuss this further. Thank you so much for your time on the program this morning. So let's just delve straight into it. You're a firm believer of embracing the past, but also, learning lessons from it in order to chart a way forward. We clearly do come from our past.
Yes, look, we had slavery in South Africa from 1652 and arguably right through to the 90s. After the abolition of slavery in 1834, slavery spread to the Boer republics, and that only came to an end in the 1890s. So about 275 years of enslavement. And the type of slavery that we had was called chattel slavery. And that meant that you could be bought, sold, rented, gifted to somebody. A timeshare could be taken out on you. You had no rights. You lived under an awful, violent system. If you ran away, your nose could get cut off, or your ears could be cut off as a punishment. You could be branded on the cheeks. We had crucifixions for 150 years in the Cape of enslaved people. It was a brutal system. There was nothing mild or benevolent about it. Yet most South Africans don't know about this aspect of our heritage. Around about 78,000 of the surviving first generation enslaved, after they had done these long sea journeys, came from Africa, from India, and from Southeast Asia and China. Their children and successive generations of grandchildren and great-grandchildren all were enslaved. Indigenous people in Africa were enslaved too. About a quarter of South Africa's population, predominantly amongst people who were classified, but also amongst people classified black and Indian, and even amongst some white, are descendants of enslaved people. Yet we don't remember this. We don't think about this. We don't celebrate it. The other aspect of enslavement that people do not realize, they think that the enslaved was simply labor. But around about 25% of enslaved were professionals and skilled artisans. In the period up from 1652 up through to 1815, less than 1% of the European or white population were actually skilled people. Over 25% of skilled people came from amongst the enslaved. So both labor and skills were brought to South Africa through slavery. And in fact, the economic foundations of South Africa are largely based on the work and effort and skills of the enslaved. So, when some European politicians, talk about we need to be grateful to colonialism because we had roads and piped water and so on. Rubbish. It wasn't the European colonials that did this. It was the enslaved that did this. African and Asian enslaved. Hence, it's important for us to restore this memory, because without restorative memory, you cannot have restorative justice. We can't craft restorative justice based on untruths. And the title of my latest book is The Truth About Slavery, and I encourage everybody to read it. One of the things that
and I think we
happens at
actually,
this time of
yeah,
the year.
we will actually get into that as well, Mr. Mellet, because I think this also comes aptly at a time where I actually saw a chilling documentary around the door of no return in Senegal. And I wanted to ask you this question because I know that, and I've been told that you believe that we should talk about the enslaved instead of the slaves. Why is that?
Look, when you say to young people, particularly in my community, the community classified as colored, or we prefer to call ourselves Camisa Africans, young people say, who the hell wants to be associated with a heritage based on slavery? I don't want to be celebrating that I have family that were slaves. And I say to people, yes, our ancestors were not slaves. They were not skepsels, objects. They were enslaved people. This aspect of being people, dignified people who were subjected to the greatest of indignities, the greatest of adversities, yet rose above those adversities and made huge contributions to this country. So I implore people to stop talking about slaves and that we have slaves as ancestors. No. We have enslaved people, skilled people, passionate people, people who contributed so much to the development of South Africa. Some of the oldest wine farms were not started by French Huguenots. In fact, there were 66 farms in the Drakensberg area before the French Huguenots arrived. And about a third of those farms were started by former enslaved, free black farmers. So you have farms like Angola, which had its name changed to Lanzarak, farms like Bengal, which were changed to Leefop Hoop, even Groot Constantia, the second greatest owner of Groot Constantia, was a daughter of an enslaved woman, Anna de Koning. This aspect of our history and heritage is not understood by our young people. So they don't want to be associated with indignity and being down at heel. And that's what the term slave projects. So therefore we talk rather about our enslaved ancestors and elaborate on who exactly they were and what they contributed.
I'd definitely say this is, a significant part of our history. And now some of the other voices as well in society who feel that this does not really immediately affect them in a way. And Mr. Mellet, looking at this significant part of history, do you feel it's somewhat maybe being watered down or perhaps being sanitized or being totally silenced in a way?
Yes. This history and heritage has, in fact, been made invisible. Nobody talks about it. We don't have celebratory days. We don't have, even in Cape Town, a dignified marker in the form of a monument to the people that built the city. At best, the city council did the SOP, where they built a few little blocks of granite in Church Square. I mean, an insult really to this history. I helped to establish the Iziko Slave Lodge Museum and the Camisa Museum at the castle, where we do try to tell this story. But it needs to be more in the public. It's great that your television station has given us some time to explain this heritage. It needs to be taught in our schools. If a quarter of our population have roots in enslavement, why is everybody so ignorant of this? The shame has to be taken out of this. We have to give pride of place. We recently had the return of the body of the freedom fighter Basil February from Zimbabwe. People with names of the month as their surnames are descendants of enslaved. And it would be wonderful, for instance, to see in Cape Town a monument that recognizes this great freedom fighter Basil February, but also at the same time talks about the people that he comes from, the heritage of enslavement that gave birth to him and to many of us. I have 26 people in my family tree who were enslaved in their lifetime at the Cape. I have a further 3 who were brought here as banished people from Timor, and I also have 8 queer people in my family tree, including my great-grandmother. And of course, I have about 19 Europeans from 7 different countries also in my family tree. This is the diversity that many of us carry within us, but we don't celebrate it. And in fact, I'm fond of using the phrase, the ties that bind us as South Africans. One of those things that bind us across the race silos is this experience of enslavement in our history, African and Asian enslaved. There is also a lack of understanding that 48,000 of those first generation enslaved came from other African countries, largely from East Africa. And the others, 17,000, came from India and Sri Lanka, and around 13,000 came from the broad Southeast Asian arena, running from Myanmar and Thailand right through to China and Indonesia, Asia, Borneo, etc., etc. It's a wonderful story to tell. People from over 105 localities around the globe brought here in chains, and yet a people emerged from this who have risen over above the greatest of adversities. And I would argue, as Alice Walker says, and still we rise.
And, you speak of ties that bind us as people, and it's quite sad that we'd also have some of those ties that bind us entrenched in, such a dark past. And Mr. Mellet, let's talk about now more about packaging this, packaging this history in an honest way, in an honest reflection of what it actually was, pay it forward, even for those young ones that you talk about right now to be able to consume it and pay it forward.
Well, there are a number of ways that we do this and can do this. I am actually amazed at how creative some of our youth have been. There have been stage plays, there have been dance shows, there has been music and poetry, there's been writing, there's been apparel, all made around this theme of our heritage rooted in this dark past of enslavement. So that's one way that I must encourage people to carry on doing this, and they have so far been doing it very, very well. Hopefully, Department of Sport, Arts and Culture will invest something more in those kinds of productions. But we also, as I say, need something in the public space. There needs to be a central monument to the enslaved and their contribution to South Africa, and Cape Town is in a prominent place in the city, should be doing this. And then secondly, it should be part of our national calendar of holidays, of celebratory days. There are a number of elements that you could look at. For instance, we can look at Emancipation Day on December the 1st in 1834. We celebrated the 190th anniversary this December. And in fact, I celebrated it at one of the mission stations that was founded by freed enslaved people at Elam. We could also look at the factor that the greatest rebellion of enslaved people took place in 1808 on the 25th of October, in which 346 rebel enslaved people marched in 2 columns from the farmlands of Cape Town in Malmesbury and the Tygerberg area to take over the castle. And they were stopped in Salt River by the cavalry Lord Caledon, who was sent out to, and the largest ever treason trial in South Africa. The treason trial of Nelson Mandela and others in the mid-1950s was half the size of the original treason trial in 1808 in December. And that was resulted in 40 people being sent to Robben Island and 5 people, the leaders, being brutally executed in the city. We could either celebrate the memory of enslavement by that date or by December the 1st. Others have suggested the 2nd of New Year. And what is the significance of the 2nd of New Year? On New Year's Day, the enslaved were having to wait hand and foot on the slave masters and madams who were celebrating New Year. They had to cook, they had to clean, they had to look children. But on the 2nd of New Year, the enslaved had the day off. And on their day off, they chose to make merry, make music, march. And one of the things, and it's happened all over the slave route along over the world, is that these carnivals that would happen on the 2nd of New Year, people would dress up like their masters and madams in garish outfits and wear masks, and then they would make khat, they would make jokes in front of their masters and madams, speaking truths and madams, speaking truth to power behind the disguise. We in Cape Town, we have what we call the Klopse Carnival or the minstrels, this tradition, which is based going back to those days when the 2nd of New Year was then celebrated. And we have a name for it in the Cape. We call it Tweede Nuwe Jaar. It's the second New Year. And some people argue that that would be an appropriate date to also remember enslavement and the heritage of the enslaved and their contribution to South Africa. So I've given you a bouquet of things that we could be doing, and I would be failing in my duty if I didn't say that there should be one other thing, and that is that the story of enslavement should be part of the curriculum at schools. The story of both the enslaved, the African nation enslaved, and the story of the Cape indigenous peoples, the Kwe and the San and Khulukwebe, should be taught in our schools so that we understand our true history and heritage in South Africa, and not the lies of 1652 that have been rammed down our throats, and the lies about mild and benevolent slavery at the Cape, which is just, absolute nonsense.
And you just took us straight down memory lane, and you also touched on the Tweede Nuwe Jaar. And so much has also been said. I want to understand from you, what do you think it should be used as? Should it be a time for celebration, a time for reflection, or a time for mourning? What's your take?
Look, I don't think it's a time for mourning. I think that mourning is a very important part of life, and mourning is less about the dead or the deceased than about the living. So I'm fully respectful of us needing to find time to mourn. But I think that we often talk about the victimhood of enslavement. But I think the 2nd of New Year is a celebration of our ability to rise above adversity. And that is a joyous thing. It is a celebration. It is something that we should be celebrating. And also, part of enslavement was restriction, control of movement. The first pass laws on the people who had to carry passes longer than anybody else in South African history were the enslaved and the Kwe in the Cape, long before passes were made obligatory for other population groups in South Africa. What Tweede Nuwe Jaar does is it gives us an opportunity to celebrate the freedom to walk in our city, the freedom to walk without control of movement. So it's a celebratory thing. Part of our culture, in the Cape, we talk about guma, the guma beat, the guma music. The term guma is a creolized term which stems from an old African word, ngoma, the drum, the way of the drum, the way of dance, the way of singing. It is a traditional faith throughout Southern Africa, the faith of ngoma. We talk of the sangomas, who are the practitioners and shamans of this faith. The guma drum and the guma music in Cape Town is what happens on Tweede Nuwe Jaar. So there is this combination of the freedom of walking without control, free of pass laws. And then there's also the drum and the way of the drum, the spirituality that was brought to the Cape by those enslaved who were called Masbikers. The Masbikers were enslaved people who were trafficked through Mozambique Island off the coast of Sofala in Mozambique. They came from across Southern Africa and the Great Lakes region and Madagascar. And collectively, they were called Masbikers or Mozambiques, and they were largely sent to Brazil and Venezuela in Latin America, but many of them were sold here at the Cape as well. And in fact, we had at Masbiker Beach, which some people know as Clifton Beach, we had a ship with 500 souls on board that sank just meters off the shore of that beach where people party today. And 200 drowned and 300 were then sold from that beach. Speakers, and the speakers that brought ngoma, and which we call the guma, which is part of the march of the Tweede Nuwe Jaar klopse or minstrels. So it's definitely a day for celebration, but part of that celebration has to be memory. And unfortunately, many people don't know what I'm talking about here. They don't know the memory behind klopse. They see the American minstrelly element, which was brought later. There are pictures, old paintings that show these marches in Cape Town, and they were considered to be freedom marches, celebration of freedom marches. So not mourning, definitely celebration.
All right, in reflections and conversations there, Tariq Mellet, Cape slavery historian, author, and councillor at the South African Heritage Resources Agency. Thank you so much for your comprehensive insights on the program this morning.